probably the last 10 years. I love this program. I'm super excited to see what you guys have for us. All right, so let's get into it. Please introduce yourselves.
My name is Lane Weeks.
I am Kylie Packrell.
I'm Landon Harrell.
My name is Charlotte Winters.
My name is Gabe Skinner. We're Reeds Unit 5, and our wonderful teachers, Mr. Tao and Ms. Karsten.
All right, Unit 5. We have selected for you question number 1. The United States Supreme Court has recognized streets, sidewalks, and parks as locations where the government's ability to permissibly restrict expressive conduct is very limited. How should the government be able to limit its expressive conduct in these locations, if at all? In what ways have social movements historically relied on public spaces to express their views or demand change? What kinds of public spaces has the Supreme Court treated differently, and why might those distinctions matter for free expression today? You may begin.
The government should only be allowed to limit expressive conduct in streets, sidewalks, and parks on account of the decisions in Cox v. New Hampshire and United States v. Grace. The court ruled the time, place, and manner of speech is not protected when they interfere with public safety.
This decision still upholds our First Amendment rights because the limits must be content neutral. While these limits are still a restriction, they are regional, culture specific, and are often only enforced for egregious violations like public indecency and disturbing the peace.
In Clark v. Community for Creative Nonviolence, the court upheld a restriction in camping in public parks, despite it being used as a form of protest. The court reasoned the rule was justified in protecting the park's condition and applied equally to everyone, not just the protesters.
Similarly, in Ward v. Rock Against Racism, the court upheld New York City's regulation requiring the use of city-provided sound equipment in Central Park, as the rule was a reasonable way to control noise without silencing expression. These cases show how the government may limit expressive conduct in public spaces if the restrictions are A, content neutral, and B, may serve a compelling government interest.
The court requires the government use the least restrictive means when limiting speech so people can still express themselves. This balance ensures that free speech rights are protected while maintaining order and public safety in streets, sidewalks, and parks.
Social movements have historically relied on these public spaces as democratic stages, where activists demand attention. Abolitionists in the 1830s held meetings in town squares when newspapers refused to carry their views. In the 1912 Bread and Roses strikers used parades through city streets to demand fairness for women and children immigrant mill workers.
State troopers brutally attacked peaceful protesters during the Selma to Montgomery March, in which they used a public highway to expose racial injustice. This event was televised nationwide and pressured President Lyndon B. Johnson and Congress to act, helping to secure the Voting Rights Act.
Just 2 months ago, a Code Pink protest took place at Legends and Sparks, where demonstrators used the public sidewalk to make their anti-Israel message visible to those passing by. These examples show how public spaces remain central to protest, and thus any restrictions on expressive conduct in these areas must be narrowly tailored.
Not all public spaces are treated equally when it comes to free expression, requiring higher standards for limits on speech within streets or parks. In Hague v. CIO, Jersey City enforced ordinances which ban labor union meetings and the distribution of literature in public places without a permit. The Supreme Court ruled that this restriction violated the rights of freedom of assembly and speech.
Yet, restrictions on speech in other public spaces, airports for example, aren't held to the same level of scrutiny. In International Society for Krishna Consciousness v. Lee, the court upheld a ban on handing out flyers in airport terminals, saying airports are for travel, not public speech. In Morse v. Frederick, the court struck down drug-related expression because of the compelling interest of school districts to limit student drug use.
In Acosta v. City of Costa Mesa, the Ninth Circuit held that a person's speech in a city council meeting can be limited when it becomes disruptive. These distinctions for free expression matter today because astute activists can understand the First Amendment landscape when strategizing how best to advance their message. John Locke said, "Liberty is not license," meaning reason dictates limits on our liberty for the concern of the rights of others.
Thank you.
Well, guys brought up Morse v. Frederick, which I haven't heard yet today. So, but that leads me into a question I have been asked today, and that is, I want to ask you about college campuses. And I'm not asking you for a discussion of private versus public universities. I'm really talking about public spaces, public universities. How do we handle free speech on college campuses? And, how is that maybe different from speech in high schools or middle schools? And should it be different?
College campuses have much more leniency when it comes to freedom of speech compared to high schools. As established in the court case Sweezy versus New Hampshire, it established the right of academic expression in colleges.
Similarly, in the case Papish v. Board of Curators of the University of Missouri, the court ruled that they could not restrict a student's offensive cartoon just solely on viewpoint discrimination.
And while tests like the Tinker test are still applicable at universities, it is important to note that the students are no longer wards of the state and are thus treated as adults when it comes to free expression.
Universities are more lax instead of places like high schools. For example, in a high school, in the case Hazelwood v. Kohlmeyer, they restricted a student's speech in a newspaper because she was saying explicit things, and the principal wanted to make sure that this wasn't disrupting the learning of students.
On the other side, in high schools, in the case West Virginia v. Barnett, it established that with the First Amendment right of speech, you also have the right free of speech. And in this case, Jehovah's Witness students did not have to say the Pledge of Allegiance.
You all gave a lot of examples of, and of course this is one of the main sub-questions, about the way that free speech can be used by social movements to affect change and move democracy forward. But of course, the First Amendment is also often known and understood as a double-edged sword. So because it is content neutral, it allows any and all kinds of speech in these kinds of public forums. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that and some risks that exist if the government gives too much freedom to certain kinds of speech.
An example of speech that's protected but not popular would be hate speech with Snyder v. Phelps, and it's protected under Brandenburg v. Ohio with the Brandenburg test, that is, speech can be limited if and only if it is directed at producing or inciting imminent lawless action, and if it is likely to incite or produce such action. Another form of speech that is also protected but not liked would be flag burning with Texas v. Johnson.
Similar to flag burning, also in the case Virginia v. Black, they determined that cross burning was protected as long as it was not done in a dangerous or in a threatening way.
Funeral protests are also very controversial. We can see this in McQueasy v. Stumbo, as well as Snyder-Roper v. Nixon, where two lower courts in Kentucky and Missouri upheld a law which stated that you can protest at a funeral, and this was later in the Supreme Court taken by Snyder v. Phelps when protesters started saying hateful things like "thank God for dead soldiers" at a funeral.
But the government has been restricting certain types of speech. Take Miller v. California, where they restricted obscenity, creating the Miller test, which determines what obscenity is and how that is not constitutional, and you do not have any protections for obscenity.
One of the most famous protests that used public spaces was the civil rights movement, particularly the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the Selma protest that you talked about in your opening. And I think we would all agree that they were on a traditional public forum, a public street, highway. They were walking, protesting, and they got beat up by the police. You mentioned that the Voting Rights Act was sort of a result of this creating political pressure on President Johnson. But what sort of remedy should we have for government actors or others who are clearly violating First Amendment rights, as we would all agree happened in Selma? What remedies, how do we enforce the First Amendment? How should we enforce it?
We can enforce the First Amendment by creating stricter programs and consequences for enforcers who use their position to go beyond, such as with police and National Guard.
And we can also start getting ahead of the curve on some of these problems. The court has been deciding things that can have detrimental consequences to our safety and our First Amendment speech, like the recent decision in Miller v. U.S., which determined a private search doctrine for AI and artificial intelligence, which sets a dangerous precedent for the future.
Well, I wanna kind of follow up, so I think, I'm sorry, Kylie, I cannot read your guys' things. So Kylie had just said, you know, stricter programs are consequences. Okay, so what? Give me an example. What should happen to someone who violates someone else's First Amendment rights? What is that, in the real world, we're talking philosophy here, First Amendment. In the real world, what happens? What do we do?
I think that the level that is most affected by would be punishments would be the police, who have been known to limit First Amendment rights and effectively strong arm people trying to use their First Amendment rights. And I think that this boils down to, we need associations for independent training for like fair policing practices for police that would help to kind of lower the mistrust that the American people have in the police, which is not what they're there for. They are there to maintain the peace.
I think we also have more trust in police than other countries. In Europe, someone wore a plasticine action shirt, and they arrested him for it because they thought it said Palestine action.
I'm going to disagree with my colleague. In Eastern Europe, the programs that train police are much longer and more extensive than those taken here in the US. And we see that it leads to more trust of police in those countries.
And this is echoed through ideas that go way back from Locke. His idea, roughly paraphrased, that the liberty of my fist ends at the liberty of your nose, which, you know, is just because we have this liberty and these protections in the Bill of Rights, in America, we are not able to infringe on others' rights with the use of our own rights.
And I think the power of the executive branch has gone far too far. Take the use it or lose it doctrines established in many police stations, and how they are allowed to use decommissioned military gear for regular day and protests. And going off what my colleague said was strong arming people, they use these to desensitize people from practicing their First Amendment speech, and getting rid of these programs and demilitarizing the police could allow people the safety and the peace of mind to go out and practice their First Amendment protections.
And sometimes when these First Amendment protections are violated, people generally like to speak up. And as Audre Lorde said, the master's tool cannot dismantle the master's house, meaning that when we are protesting peacefully and we're not receiving any feedback from this, it would turn violent, as seen in many history cases.
Adding on to my colleague Lane, the use of those militaristic equipment for the use of regular police, we've seen that go wrong. For example, at the Kelma State University, where there was a peaceful protest on the university that ended up with multiple injuries and some fatalities.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, I think this is a really interesting conversation, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about maybe ways that time, place, and manner restrictions can be weaponized in ways that are really about content. And I think the Selma Bridge is kind of a good example of that we've talked about in some other classes. But if you could talk about, I think I'm really interested in sort of this critical discussion about the case law. And so in what ways do you see sort of the government claiming that this is content neutral, and that may not be the case?
We see this in a lot of the tests that are used to determine if speech is protected or not, and the overall vagueness of the test. Like Tinker v. Des Moines, which is used in schools, the Tinker test is there a reasonable forecast of substantial disruption? And who decides what is reasonable and what is going to be disruptive?
In Ward v. Rock Against Racism, they limited the rock concert's volume for content neutral policies.
Yeah, adding on to that, this was a court case, or a case that determined that suppression is not, or the suppression of the sound of their voices was not based on anything with the content that they were producing. It could have been any sort of content, and they would have had the same exact restrictions.
And going off your question of time, place, and manner restrictions, even in Nevada, specifically Washoe and Clark County, there are 24-hour noise ordinance laws that are, of course, determined by the police when they say what is too loud or too quiet.
An example of the content neutral going too far would be President Trump, what he said inciting the January 6th march on the Capitol, which would be protected under the Brandenburg test, because what can you decide is imminent lawless action when many would agree that that was?
Thank you.
You get to go first.
I get to go first this time? Okay. Wow, good job. Lots of information here. I thought we were gonna hear the Christian consciousness case once, and I told another group that I was wrong about that. We heard it again today. Great job. Just clearly understand the case. First, we heard a Ninth Circuit case today, the Acosta case about public meetings. Had never heard about that. A case you might want to know since you're in the Ninth Circuit, huh? Mr. Cole. So just really great job using the evidence to make your points, especially with a group of 5 of you. It's kind of difficult to get a word in edgewise, and I think you all sort of managed to do that, particularly in the cross-section. So very good job. Clear understanding of this issue and clear understanding of how difficult these things are. It's not just, we don't divide the world up into traditional public forum, limited public forum, and non-public forum. New things happen. New fora are created. We have social media. We didn't even ask you about that, right? We have quasi sort of limited public forum. We didn't talk about January 6th, but kind of moving from the street with the same protest into a different space. How does that change the character of the protest and whether it's legal or not? So it's very gray, and you clearly teased all of this stuff out. Couple points I would make, just moving forward. There was a comment about Virginia versus Black. So remember, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Virginia versus Black is about cross-burning. And Senator O'Connor said, cross-burning is a special kind of speech. It's not a special kind of hate speech, not protected. Okay, so I think one of you said it was protected. It's not. Cross-burning is different because it carries the history of cross-burning, right? The KKK used it as an intimidation tool. And so keep that in mind, and please fact check me, but that's something that you should clear up. And then there was a master's tools quote, right? I think
Yeah.
Dr. Lord said you must use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, right? So just when you're using things like this, make sure you get these things right. But otherwise, good job being creative about the remedies and fair policing practices and stuff. We were trying to tease out the limits of the First Amendment. I thought you did a really good job expressing it those ways. So you should be proud of yourselves. Good job.
Great job, you guys. A lot of case law, really well done, and a lot of really interesting examples. I really loved when you pulled local examples. I thought that really showed your ability to apply, right, these big philosophical Supreme Court cases and saying, look at this code pink protest, look at what's happening in Washoe County. I thought that was really effective and creative. I think I would have loved, I think we got into I think this is one of the most controversial units. I think it's the most kind of emotional appeal and engagement, and kind of invites a lot of your own opinions and perspectives, which I really enjoy. I think I would have liked a little bit more of that in your opening. I think I wasn't quite drawn in until we got into the conversation, and then you really had me. Something that I love during, you guys call it cross-section? It's not cross-examination. Follow-up, whatever. You are like one unit. It was so amazing. I mean, we were asking questions there's no way you could have prepared for, and it was like you were passing the baton. I thought it was some of the most impressive division between our biggest group so far, and everyone shared. Everyone was clearly so prepared, and you were so able to build off each other. And I really respect and appreciate when you can disagree with each other and build on each other, and it still felt like one unit. So I thought that was really, really impressive. Great work.
Yes,
Yeah.
you guys have great balanced participation. You guys have an exceptional amount of case law, like exceptional. A couple of things. I think your strongest section was, the double-edged sword. I think you guys, did kind of hit that out of the park. So college campuses, I've asked this question of every group. It's been in my opinion, it's been kind of a struggle from every group. You guys gave me the most case law out of anyone.
Yeah.
So you were able to answer that legal part of it. What I didn't think you answered was my second question, and I was looking for a little bit more like thought and opinion on the role of college campuses versus the role of a high school. Where should the line be? And then I'm just not getting any examples from teams. Like, there's a lot that goes on college campuses, and there's been a lot in the news. I know Israel, Palestine, and Columbia University was like a recent one, but like, I've been talking again because we're both Cal Berkeley alumni. It's like, there was, just a couple of years ago, there was like a controversial conservative speaker that the young Republicans wanted to bring on campus. I don't think it was Charlie Kirk, but it was someone else. And there were protests about it, and then I think the university ended up pulling it, and that garnered a ton of, so I was looking for some discussion about that and sort of what's going on. And then again, another group did bring this up, and this just pulled me in, and I think every group should talk about this, is what's going on at Oklahoma University right now, where a TA got fired for giving a bad grade to a student who wrote a terrible paper and cited the Bible. And now that student is saying, well, they should have been fired because that was a violation of my First Amendment right to freedom of religion. You guys, you're looking confused. Yeah, I'm confused too, but look it up. Like, so there's some it's a perfect vision of what's going on in this country right now. It really highlights everything that's happening here. And but there's just a lot of interesting stuff going on. So that I want a more robust discussion from, but in fairness to you guys, I've said this to every single team I've asked this question of. I think the one thing for you guys that I did notice, and Z kind of highlighted a little bit with those two quotes, or two things that you brought up, Virginia v. Blackmore, is I did find sometimes that you had some things that you really wanted to squeeze in, and you were just gonna put them in no matter what, whether they really fit or not, whether they really answered the question or not. And like, you know, we noticed that. So I think try your best to not worry about that, because to me, honestly, you had more than enough evidence in this to probably get a 10 on evidence. Whether or not you squished in a few more or not, that in my opinion didn't really fit. Does that make sense? So be confident in your knowledge, and you can, rarely do we say this to a team, but you can honestly focus more on the conversation and less on getting in more evidence, because you have enough evidence. But I want to talk to you and hear your opinion as well, and the beauty, like the perfect unity is getting both of those things in at the same time. Okay? Great, good job.